All right, let's get this stream started. What is up, everybody? Hold on, let me check and make sure it's going over the interwebs. We're going to get into this tragedy and hope in a second. We're just going to jump right into it, but first, got to give a big shout out to General Tito, Hardcore Tito. He's one of the old school red pill MGTOW type guys that was banned, shadow banned. He's had several channels in the past, all ripped to shreds for no reason other than him speaking the truth. I got his book here, and I'll be honest, I haven't read the whole thing yet. I got his book here. It's called The 12 Rules American Society Has for Black Men by General Tito. And on the front, it has a quote that says, "This book is sure to anger many." All right. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you in case you want to get it yourself, but I just want to, it's a really densely written book, but the font is good, is a good size, and it's like a pocket size book. It's 111 pages. It's a real book. He's got, a lot of historical facts and references in here, and it's written in an intellectual but also easy to access manner, which I would say. But I just want to read a little line here out of it just so you can get kind of the taste of his writing style and what he's talking about in the book. So here's the quote. It's on page 2. I'm on chapter 3 though, so I'm not just. The same black woman with a degree in HR management will spend 8 hours a day gatekeeping at a temp service denying black men employment opportunities, will meet her friends after work and complain about how broke black men are. So that's just a little, that's like one sentence. That's just one sentence out of this book. He's ripping it. So yeah, anybody saying, oh, it's not a real book or something like that, it's a real book. It's going to take me a while to get through this. Been kind of shadow watching the brother's channel. Let me give him a subscribe. Nice. What happened to my... Oh, here we go. Wait. Let me make sure the PDF is in the description. So we got the transition integrity program in there. I hate it when Restream does that. I'll just like cut off and say it's offline, but it's not offline. All right, let's go. Chapter 2, page 24, Tragedy and Hope, Europe's Shift to the 20th Century. While Europe's traits were diffusing outward to the non-European world, Europe was also undergoing profound changes and facing difficult choices at home. These choices were associated with drastic changes, in some cases we might say reversals of Europe's point of view. These changes may be examined under 8 headings the 19th century was marked by 1. Belief in the innate goodness of man. See, I think I'm kind of stuck on that still. Secularism. Belief in progress. Liberalism. Capitalism. I'm definitely on that one. Faith in science. Nah, not faith. Democracy. Nationalism. It sounds good. In general, these 8 factors went along together in the 19th century. They were generally regarded as being compatible with one another. The friends of one were generally the friends of the other, and the enemies of one were generally the enemies of the rest. Metternich and de Maistre were generally opposed to all 8. Thomas Jefferson and John Stuart Mill were generally in favor of all 8. The belief in the innate goodness of man had its roots in the 18th century when it appeared to many that man was born good and free, but was everywhere distorted, corrupted, and enslaved by bad institutions and conventions. As Rousseau said, man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. Thus arose the belief in the noble savage, the romantic nostalgia for nature and for the simple nobility and honesty of the inhabitants of a faraway land. If only man could be freed, they could be felt, freed from the corruption of society and its artificial conventions, freed from the burden of property, the state, of clergy, and of the rules of matrimony. Then man, it seemed clear, could rise to the heights undreamed of before, could indeed become some kind of Superman, practically a god. It was this spirit which set loose the French Revolution. It was this spirit that prompted the outburst of self-reliance and optimism so characteristic of the whole period from 1770 to 1914. Obviously, if man is innately good and needs but be freed from social restrictions, he is capable of tremendous achievements in this world of time, and does not need to postpone his hopes of personal salvation to eternity. Obviously, if man is a godlike creature whose ungodlike actions are due only to the frustrations of social conventions, there is no need to worry about service to God or devotion to any otherworldly end. Man can accomplish most by service to himself and devotion to the goals of this world. Thus came the triumph of secularism. Closely related to these 19th century beliefs that human nature is good, that society is bad, and that optimism and secularism were reasonable attitudes, were certain theories about the nature of evil. It's funny, I was going to do a video about the whole problem of evil, because that's definitely one of the logical choke points, of, what you believe, depending on how you perceive the problem of evil. Like your worldview choke point. To the 19th century, mind, evil, or sin was a negative conception. It merely indicated a lack or, at most, a distortion of good. Any idea of sin or evil as malignant, positive, as a malignant positive force opposed to good and capable of existing by its own nature was completely lacking in the typical 19th century mind. To such a mind, the only evil was frustration and the only sin repression. Just as the negative idea of the nature of evil flowed from the belief that human nature was good, So the idea of liberalism flowed from the belief that society was bad. For if society was bad, the state, which was the organized, coercive power of society, was doubly bad. And if man was good, he should be freed, above all, from the coercive power of the state. Liberalism was the crop which emerged from this soil. In its broadest aspect, liberalism believed that men should be freed from coercive power as completely as possible. In its narrowest aspect, liberalism believed that the economic activities of man should be freed completely from the state interference. This latter belief, summed up in the battle cry, "No government in business," was commonly called laissez-faire liberalism. Laissez-faire, sorry. Liberalism, which included laissez-faire, was a wider term because it would have freed men from the coercive power of any church, army, or other institution, and would have left the society little power beyond that required to prevent the strong from physically oppressing the weak. From either aspect, liberalism was based on an almost universally accepted 19th century superstition known as the community of interest. This strange and unexamined belief held that there really existed, in the long run, a community of interest between the members of a society. It maintained that, in the long run, what was good for one member of society was good for all, and that what was bad for one was bad for all. But it went much further than this. The theory of the community of interest believed that there did exist a possible social pattern in which each member of society would be secure, free, and prosperous, and that this pattern could be achieved by a process of adjustment so that each person could fall into that place in the pattern to which his innate abilities entitled him. So, meritocracy. This implied two corollaries which the 19th century was prepared to accept: that human abilities are innate and can only be distorted or suppressed by social discipline, and two, that each individual is the best judge of his own self-interest. All these together form the doctrine of the community of interest, a doctrine which maintained that if each individual does what seems best for himself, the result in the long run will be best for society as a whole. Okay. Closely related to the idea of the community of interest were two other beliefs of the 19th century: the belief in progress and in democracy. The average man of 1880 was convinced that he was the culmination of a long process of inevitable progress, which had been going on for untold millennia and which would continue indefinitely into the future. Progressivism. This belief in progress was so fixed that it intended to regard progress as both inevitable and automatic. Out of the struggles and conflicts of the universe, better things were constantly emerging, and the wishes or plans of the objects themselves had little to do with the process. So it's like, this is definitely like the progressive idea that, but it is kind of interesting because Jay Dyer does point out a lot that, both of these sides are both liberal, both the Republican and the Democrat side. So it's kind of like, the progressives kind of see infinite like social moral growth, and the conservative Republican type, like capitalist conservatives, more they see infinite, financial growth, infinite financial progress. Okay. The idea of democracy was also accepted as inevitable, although not always desirable for the 19th century, could not completely submerge a lingering feeling that rule by the best or rule by the strong would be better than rule by majority. But the facts of political development made by the majority, made rule by majority unavoidable. Okay, but the facts of political development made rule by majority unavoidable, and it came to be accepted, at least in Western Europe especially, since it was compatible with liberalism and with the community of interest. Liberalism, community of interest, and the belief in progress led almost inevitably to the practice and theory of capitalism. Capitalism was an economic system in which the motivating force was the desire for private profit as determined in a price system. Such a system, it was felt, by seeking the aggrandization of profits for each individual, would give unprecedented economic progress under liberalism and in accord with the community of interest. In the 19th century, this system, in association with the unprecedented advance of natural science, had given rise to industrialism, that is, power production, and urbanism, that is, city life, both of which were regarded as inevitable concomitants, meaning together, of progress by most people. So basically, everybody just accepted that, we're going to have, huge factories and huge cities. Okay. Both of which were regarded as inevitable concomitants of progress by most people, but with the greatest suspicion by a persistent and vocal minority. The 19th century was also an age of science. By this term, we mean the belief that the universe obeyed rational laws which could be found by observation and could be used to control it. So this is scientism. Anyone? This belief was closely connected with the optimism of the period, with its belief in inevitable progress and with secularism. The latter appeared as a tendency towards materialism. This could be defined as the belief that all reality is ultimately explicable in terms of the physical and chemical laws which apply to temporal matter. Atheistic materialism. The last attribute of the 19th century is by no means the least: nationalism. It was the great age of nationalism, a movement which has been discussed in many lengthy, inconclusive books, but which can be defined for our purposes as a movement for political unity with those with whom we believe we are akin. As such, nationalism in the 19th century had a dynamic force which worked in two directions. On one side, it served to bind persons to the same nationality together into a tight, emotionally satisfying unit. On the other side, it served to divide persons of different nationality into antagonistic groups, often to the injury of their real, mutual political, economic, or cultural advantages. So sometimes nationalism isn't good. Thus, in the sorry, hold on a second. Thus, in the period to which we refer, nationalism sometimes acted as a cohesive force, creating a united Germany, a united Italy out of a medley of distinct political units. But sometimes, on the other hand, nationalism acted as a disruptive force within such dynastic states as the Habsburg Empire or the Ottoman Empire, splitting these great states into a number of distinctive political units. These characteristics of the 19th century have been so largely modified in the 20th century that it might appear at first glance as if the latter were nothing more than the opposite of the former. This is not completely accurate, but there can be no doubt that most of these characteristics have been drastically modified in the 20th century. This change has arisen from a series of shattering experiences which have profoundly disturbed patterns of behavior and belief, of social organization and human hopes. Of these shattering experiences, the chief were the trauma of the First World War, the long drawn-out agony of the World Depressions, and the unprecedented violence of destruction of the Second World War. Of these three, the First World War was undoubtedly the most important to the people who believed in the innate goodness of man. In inevitable progress, in the community of interest, and in evil as merely the absence of good, the First World War, with its millions of persons dead and billions of dollars wasted, was a blow so terrible as to be beyond human ability to comprehend. As a matter of fact, no real success was achieved in comprehending it. The people of the day regarded it as a temporary and inexplicable aberration to be ended as soon as possible and forgotten as soon as ended. Accordingly, men were almost unanimously in 1919 in their determination to restore the world of 1913. This effort was a failure. After 10 years of effort to conceal the new reality of social life by a facade painted to look like 1913, the facts burst through the pretense, and men were forced, willingly or not, to face the grim reality of the 20th century. The events which destroyed the pretty dream world of 1919 to 1929 were the stock market crash, the World Depression, the world financial crisis, and ultimately the martial clamor of rearmament and aggression. Thus, depression and war forced men to realize that the old world of the 19th century had passed forever, and made them seek to create a new world in accordance with the facts of the present-day conditions. This new world, the child of the period of 1914 to 1945, assumed its recognizable form only as the first half of the 20th century drew to a close. I'm on page 28 now. Okay. In contrast with the 19th century belief that human nature is innately good and that society is corrupting, the 20th century came to believe that human nature is, if not entirely, The 20th century came to believe that human nature is, if not innately bad, at least capable of being very evil. Left to himself, it seems today, man falls very easily to the level of the jungle or even lower, and this result can be prevented only by training and the coercive power of society. Thus, man is capable of great evil, but society can prevent this. Social justice warriors. Along with this change from good men and bad society to bad men and good society has appeared a reaction from optimism to pessimism, from secularism to religion. At the same time, the view that evil is merely the absence of good has been replaced with the idea that evil is a very positive force which must be resisted and overcome. The horrors of Hitler's concentration camps and of Stalin's slave labor units are chiefly responsible for this change. Associated with these changes are a number of others. The belief that human abilities are innate and should be left free from social duress in order to display themselves has been replaced by the idea that human abilities are the result of social training and must be directed to socially acceptable ends. Thus, liberalism and laissez-faire are to be replaced apparently by social discipline and planning. The community of interest, which would appear if men were merely left to pursue their own desires, has been replaced by the idea of the welfare community, which must be created by a conscious organizing action. The belief in progress has been replaced by the fear of social retrogression or even human annihilation. The old march of democracy now yields to the insidious advance of authoritarianism, and the individual capitalism of the profit motive seems about to be replaced by the state capitalism of the welfare economy. Science on all sides is challenged by mysticism. Science on all sides is challenged by mysticism, some of which march under the banner of science itself. Urbanism has passed its peak and is replaced by suburbanism or even flight to the country. And nationalism finds its patriotic appeal challenged by appeals to much wider groups of class, ideological, and continental scope. We have already given some attention to the fashion in which a number of Western European innovations, such as industrialism and the demographic explosion, diffused outward to the peripheral, non-European world at such different rates of speed that they arrived in Asia in quite a different order from that in which they left Western Europe. The same phenomenon can be seen within Western civilization in regard to the 19th century characteristics of Europe, which we have enumerated. For example, nationalism was already evident in England at the time of the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1518. It raged through France in the period after 1789 and reached Germany and Italy only after 1815. Became a potent force in Russia and the Balkans towards the end of the 19th century, and was noticeable in China, India, and Indonesia, and even Negro Africa only in the 20th century. Page 29 now. So, got some juice, no coffee. No coffee. Somewhat similar patterns of diffusion can be found in regard to the spread of democracy, of parliamentary government, of liberalism, and of secularism. The rule, however, is not so general or so simple as it appears at first glance. The exceptions and the complications appear more numerous as we approach the 20th century. Even earlier, it was evident that the arrival of the sovereign state did not follow this pattern. Enlightened despotism and the growth of the supreme public authority appearing in Germany and even in Italy before it appeared in France. Universal free education also appeared in Central Europe before it appeared in the Western country like England. Socialism is also a product of Central Europe rather than of Western Europe, and moved from the former to the latter only in the 5th decade of the 20th century. These exceptions to the general rule about the eastward movement of modern historical developments have various explanations. Some of these are obvious, but others are very complicated. As an example of such a complication, we might mention that in Western Europe, nationalism, industrialism, liberalism, and democracy were generally reached in this order, but in Germany, they all appeared about the same time. To the Germans, it appeared that they could achieve nationalism and industrialism, both of which they wanted, more rapidly and more successfully if they sacrificed liberalism and democracy. Thus, in Germany, nationalism was achieved in an undemocratic way by blood and iron, as Bismarck put it, while industrialism was achieved under state auspices rather than through liberalism. This selection of elements and the resulting playing off of elements against one another was possible in more peripheral areas only because these areas had the earlier experience of Western Europe to study, copy, avoid, or modify. Sometimes they had to modify these traits as they developed. This can be seen from the following considerations. When the Industrial Revolution began in England and France, these countries were able to raise the necessary capital for new factories because they already had the agricultural revolution and because the earliest producers of industrial goods, they made excessive profits which could be used to provide capital. But in Germany and Russia, the capital was much more difficult to find because they obtained the Industrial Revolution later, when they had to compete with England, France, and could not earn such large profits, and also because they did not already have an established agricultural revolution on which to build their Industrial Revolution. That's interesting because China gives similar excuses in the United Nations, or not excuses, sorry, arguments in the United Nations as to why they're allowed to still pollute while we're not. Because basically they're claiming that, they didn't have time to go through the Industrial Revolution, and if you cut off their, pollution, then they can't compete because they didn't have time to develop and go through that process. Accordingly, while Western Europe, with plenty of capital and cheap democratic weapons, could finance its industrialization with liberalism and democracy, Central and Eastern Europe had difficulty financing industrialism, and there the process was delayed to a period when cheap and simple democratic weapons were being replaced by expensive and complicated weapons. This meant that the capital for railroads and factories had to be raised with government assistance. Liberalism waned. Rising nationalism encouraged this tendency, and the undemocratic nature of existing weapons made it clear that both liberalism and democracy were living a most precarious existence. As a consequence of situations such as this, some of the traits which arose in Western Europe in the 19th century moved outward to the more peripheral areas of Europe and Asia with great difficulty and for only a brief period. Among these less sturdy traits of Western Europe's great century, we might mention liberalism, democracy, the parliamentary system, optimism, and the belief in inevitable progress. These were, we might say, flowers of such delicate nature that they could not survive any extended period of stormy weather. That the 20th century subjected them to long periods of very stormy weather is clear when we consider that it brought a world economic depression sandwiched between two world wars. So you can see there what he's talking about, that It's the same thing, because I hear a lot of, white nationalists talking about Eastern Europe, and when they get this question about, well, they kind of say, well, Eastern Europeans aren't white because they didn't develop the same things. Well, this kind of explains why that happened. Because it's like that same system where if you don't have the agriculture first to build up, to feed everybody, to then be able to go into the factories and work, and then the factories produce the goods like clean water and power, food, stuff like that. So then you can build up your cities and all that stuff and have a bunch of like smarter people managing the society. Then you get screwed, right? And so the way that, and then they go to the second way, which is when you don't have enough, then you oppress the working class in order to siphon their labor power into the factories, so that you can build the factories and then build up the factories and then employ the smart people to manage the society and build the cities. So they decided to go. They were like, we're just going to kind of sacrifice the working class in order to build this, just to compete with Western Europe, because they got it in the proper order, because it's an evolutionary process. I'm not saying humans are evolving. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the society and how we view the world is changing rapidly. Let's see how this next chapter is. I don't know how much of this I'll be able to get through right now. It's already 5. Do at least another half hour. All right. Now we're on section 2, Western Civilization to 1914. It's patterns of change, European economic developments, commercial capitalism, industrial capitalism, financial capitalism, domestic financial practices, international financial practices, the situation before 1914 in the United States to 1917. That's what's in section 2. So we're going to start on this one. Let me get a drink real quick. The pattern of change. In order to obtain perspective, we sometimes divide the culture of a society in a somewhat arbitrary fashion into several different aspects. For example, we can divide a society into 6 aspects: military, political, economic, social, religious, intellectual. Naturally, there are very close connections between these various aspects, and in each aspect, there are very close connections between what exists today and what existed in an earlier day. For example, we might want to talk about democracy as a fact on the political level or aspect. In order to talk about it in an intelligent way, we would not only have to know what it is today, we would also have to see what relationship it had to earlier facts on the political level, as well as its relationship to various facts on the other 5 levels of society. Naturally, we cannot talk intelligently unless we have a fairly clear idea of what we mean by the words we use. For that reason, we shall frequently define the terms we use in discussing the subject. The military level is concerned with the organization of force, the political level with the organization of power, and the economic level with the organization of wealth. By the organization of power in a society, we mean the ways in which obedience and consent or acquiescence are obtained. The close relationship between levels can be seen from the fact that there are 3 basic ways to win obedience: by force, by buying consent with wealth, and by persuasion. Each of these 3 leads us to another level. military, economic, or intellectual, outside of the political level. At the same time, the organization of power today, that is, of the methods for obtaining obedience in society, is development of the methods used to obtain obedience in the society in an earlier period. What? At the same time, the organization of power today is a development of the methods used to obtain obedience in the society in an earlier period. So we're just moving forward with the same methods, but different. These relationships are important because the 20th century in Western civilization, these relationships are important because in the 20th century in Western civilization, all 6 levels are changing with amazing rapidity, and the relationships between the levels are also shifting with great speed. When we add to this confusing picture of Western civilization the fact that other societies are influencing it or being influenced by it, it would seem that the world in the 20th century is almost too complicated to understand. This is indeed true, and we shall have to simplify or perhaps even oversimplify these complexities to reach a low level of understanding. When we have reached such a low level, perhaps we shall be able to raise the level of our understanding by bringing into our minds, little by little, some of the complexities which do exist in the world itself. On the military level, in Western civilization in the 20th century, the chief development has been a steady increase in the complexity and cost of weapons. When weapons are cheap to get and so easy to use that almost anyone can use them after a short period of training, armies are generally made up of large masses of amateur soldiers. Such weapons we call amateur weapons, and such armies we might call mass armies of citizen soldiers. The age of Pericles in classical Greece and the 19th century in Western civilization were periods of amateur weapons and citizen soldiers. But the 19th century was preceded, as was the age of Pericles also, by a period in which weapons were expensive and required long training in their use. Such weapons we call specialist weapons. Periods of specialist weapons are generally periods of small armies of professional soldiers, usually mercenaries. In a period of specialist weapons, the minority who have such weapons can usually force the minority who lack them to obey. Thus, a period of specialist weapons tends to give rise to a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. But a period of amateur weapons is a period in which all men are roughly equal in military power. A majority can compel a minority to yield, and majority rule or even democratic governments tend to rise. The medieval period, in which the best weapon was usually a mounted knight on horseback, clearly a specialist weapon, was a period of minority rule and authoritarian government. When the medieval knight was made obsolete, along with his stone castle, by the invention of gunpowder and the appearance of firearms, these new weapons were so expensive and so difficult to use until 1800 that the minority rule and authoritarian government continued, even though that government sought to enforce its rule by shifting from mounted knights to professional pikemen and musketeers. But after 1800, guns became cheaper to obtain and easier to use. By 1840, Colt, a revolver, sold for $27, and a Springfield musket for not much more. And these were about as good weapons as anyone could get at the time. Thus, mass armies of citizens, equipped with these cheap and easily used weapons, began to produce armies of professional soldiers beginning about 1800. In Europe, and even earlier in America, at the same time, democratic government began to replace authoritarian governments, but chiefly in those areas where the cheap new weapons were available. But chiefly in those areas were the cheap new weapons, where the cheap new weapons were available, and local standards of living were high enough to allow people to obtain them. So basically, once they came out with like cheap guns, it became very difficult for monarchies to exist. We're on page 35 now. The arrival of the mass army of citizen soldiers in the 19th century created a difficult problem of control because of techniques of transportation and of communication had not reached a high enough level to allow any flexibility of control in a mass army. Such an army could be moved on its own feet or by railroad. The government could communicate with its various units only by letter, post, or by telegram. The problem of handling a mass army by such techniques was solved partially in the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 and completely by Helmuth von Moltke for the Kingdom of Prussia and the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. The solution was a rigid one. A plan of campaign was prepared beforehand against a specific opponent with an established timetable and detailed instruction for each military unit. Communications were prepared and even issued beforehand to be used according to the timetable. This plan was so inflexible that the signal to immobilize was practically a signal to attack the plan was so inflexible that a signal to mobilize was practically a signal to attack a specified neighboring state because the plan, once initiated, could not be changed and could hardly be slowed up. With this rigid method, Prussia created the German Empire by smashing Austria in 1866 and France in 1871. By 1900, all of the states of Europe had adopted the same method and had fixed plans in which the signal for mobilization constituted an attack on some neighbor. A neighbor in some cases, as in the German invasion of Belgium, with whom the attacker had no real quarrel. Thus, when the signal for mobilization was given in 1914, the states of Europe leaped at each other. In the 20th century, the military situation was drastically changed in two ways. On the one hand, communication and transportation were so improved by the invention of the radio and the internal combustion engine that control and movement of troops and even of individual soldiers became very flexible. Mobilization ceased to be equivalent to attack, and attack ceased to be equivalent to total war. On the other hand, beginning with the first use of tanks, gas, high explosive shells, and tactical bombing from the air in 1915 to 1918, and continuing with all the innovations in weapons leading up to the first atomic bomb in 1945, specialist weapons became superior to amateur weapons. This had a double result, which was still working itself out mid-century. The drafted army of citizen soldiers began to be replaced by a smaller army of professional specialist soldiers, and authoritarian government began to replace democratic government. On the political level, Equally profound changes took place in the 20th century. These changes were associated with the basis on which an appeal for allegiance could be placed, and especially with the need to find a basis of allegiance which could win loyalty over larger and larger areas for more numerous groups of people. In the early Middle Ages, when there had been no state and no public authority, political organizations had been the feudal system which had held together by obligations of personal fealty among small numbers of people. With the reappearance of the state and public authority, new patterns of political behavior were organized in what is called the feudal monarchy. This allowed the state to reappear for the first time since the collapse of Charlemagne's empire in the 9th century. I think that was the Ottoman Empire. But with restricted allegiance to a relatively small number of persons over a relatively small area, the development of weapons and the steady improvement in transportation and in communications made it possible to compel obedience over wider and wider areas, culminating in the TV and then going up to the internet. Because think about it, the TV is like one of the greatest tools of social cohesion. Like if you think about how small Europe is, or even look at all the countries in Africa, like there's like people speak like 500 different like mother tongues in like Nigeria alone. So without the TV creating social cohesion, it's possible that people from New Jersey wouldn't even be able to understand what people from California were saying over like a 200-300 year period. They'd be speaking completely different languages. People in Texas would be speaking a different language from people in Montana, right? The Canadians might all be speaking French now. But because of TV, we've all basically got the same accent. We can all understand each other and everything. And made it necessary to base allegiance on something wider than personal fealty to a feudal monarch. Accordingly, the feudal monarchy was replaced by the dynastic monarchy. In this system, subjects owed allegiance to a royal family dynasty, although the real basis of the dynasty rested on the loyalty of a professional army of pikesmen and musketeers. The shift from the professional army of mercenaries to the mass army of citizen soldiers, along with other factors acting on other levels of culture, made it necessary to broaden the basis of allegiance once again. After 1800s, the new basis was nationalism and gave rise to the national state as a typical political unit of the 19th century. This shift was not possible for the larger dynastic states which ruled over many different language and national groups. By the year 1900, 3 old dynastic monarchies were being threatened with disintegration by the rising tide of nationalistic agitation. These 3, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire of the Romanovs, did disintegrate as a consequence of the defeats of the First World War. But the smaller territorial units which replaced them, states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Lithuania, organized largely on the basis of language groups, may have reflected adequately enough the nationalistic sentiments of the 19th century, but they reflected very inadequately the developments in weapons and communications and transportation and in economics of the 20th century. By the middle of this latter century, these developments were reaching a point where states could produce the latest instruments of coercion, wherein a position to compel obedience, were in a position to compel obedience over much larger. Yes, hold on, let me read that again. By the middle of this latter century, these developments were reaching a point where states could produce the latest instruments of coercion, were in a position to compel obedience over areas much larger than those occupied by peoples speaking the same language or otherwise regarding themselves as sharing a common nationality. So this is like getting close to like British Empire type of stuff, where they were all over the globe. Even as early as 1940, it began to appear that some new basis, more continental in scope than existing nationality groups, must be found for new superstates which were beginning to be born. It became clear that the basis of allegiances for these new superstates of continental scope must be ideological rather than national. Thus, the 19th century's national state began to be replaced by the 20th century's ideological bloc. At the same time, the shift from amateur to specialist weapons made it likely that the new form of organization would be authoritarian rather than democratic, as the earlier nation-state had been. However, the prestige of Britain's power and influence in the 19th century was so great in the first third of the 20th century that the British parliamentary system continued to be copied everywhere, that people were called upon to set up a new form of government. So, yeah, things keep spawning from Britain because they, got everything in the correct order. And they're still the center. They're exporting everything to all these periphery states. This happened in Russia in 1917, in Turkey in 1908, in Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1918 and 1919, and in most of the states of Asia, such as China, in 1911. When we turn to the economic level, we turn to a series of complex developments. It would be pleasant if we could just ignore these, but obviously we cannot, because economic issues have been of paramount importance in the 20th century, and no one can understand the period without at least a rudimentary grasp of economic issues. In order to simplify these somewhat, we may divide them into four aspects: energy, materials, organization, and control. It is quite clear that no economic good can be made without the use of energy and materials. The history of the former falls into two chief parts, each of which is divided into two subparts. The main division, about 1830, separates an earlier period when production used energy delivered through living bodies, and later a period when production used energy from fossil fuels delivered through engines. The first half is subdivided into an earlier period of manpower and slavery, and the latter period using energy of draft animals. This subdivision occurred roughly about 1000 AD. The second half, since 1830, is subdivided into a period which used coal and steam engines and a period which used petroleum and internal combustion engines. This subdivision occurred about 1900 or a little later. The development of the use of materials is familiar to everyone. We can speak of an age of iron before 1830, an age of steel, 1830 to 1910, an age of alloys, light metals, and synthetics since 1910. Naturally, all of these dates are arbitrary and approximate, since the different periods commenced at different dates in different areas, diffusing outward from their origin in the core area of Western civilization in the northwestern Europe. When we turn to the developments which took place in economic organization, we approach a subject of great significance. Here again, we can see a sequence of several periods where 6 of these periods, each with its own typical form of economic organization. There were 6 periods, each with its own typical form of economic organization. At the beginning, in the early Middle Ages, Western civilization had an economic system which was almost entirely agricultural, organized in self-sufficient manners, with almost no commerce or industry. To this manorial agrarian system, there was added, after about 1050, a new economic system based on trade in luxury goods of remote origin for the sake of profit. This we might call commercial capitalism. It had 2 periods of expansion, one in the period of 1050 to 1270, and the other in the period of 1440 to 1690. The typical organization of these 2 periods was the trading company. In the second, we might say the chartered trading company, like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Hudson Bay Company, or the various East India companies. The next period of economic organization was the stage of industrial capitalism, beginning about 1770 and characterized by owner management through the single proprietorship or the partnership. The third period we might call financial capitalism. It began about 1850 and reached its peak about 1914 and ended about 1932. Its typical forms of economic organization were the limited liability corporation and the holding company. It was a period of financial or banker management rather than one of owner management, as in the earlier periods of industrial capitalism. So see, this is when the political power of business owners starts to shift from individual business owners to the banks and corporations, to the banks and like the larger corporations. This period of financial capitalism was followed by a period of monopoly capitalism. In this fourth period, typical forms of economic organization were cartels and trade organizations. This period began to appear about 1890, took over control of the economic system from the bankers about 1932, and is distinguished as a period of managerial dominance in contrast with the owner management and the financial management of the 2 periods immediately preceding it. Many of its characteristics continue even today, but the dramatic events of World War II and the post-war period put it in such a different social and historical context as to create a new 6th period of economic organization, which we might call the pluralist economy. The features of this 6th period will be described later. The approximate relationship of these various stages may be seen in the following table. And they're talking about all the different, he's just showing a chart of what he just went through. That's on page 38. What time is it? We still got some time left. We're doing good. 2 things should be noted. In the first place, these various stages or periods are additive in a sense, and there are many survivals of earlier stages into latter ones. As late as 1925, there was a manor still functioning in England, and Cecil Rhodes Chartered Company, which opened up in Rhodesia, the British South Africa Company, was chartered as late as 1889. In the same way, owner-managed private firms engaging in industrial activities or corporations and holding companies engaging in financial activities could be created today. In the second place, all the latter periods are called capitalism. This term means an economic system motivated by the pursuit of profits within a price system. The commercial capitalists sought profits from the exchange of goods. The industrial capitalist sought profits from the manufacture of goods. The financial capitalist sought profits from the manipulation of claims on money. The monopolistic capitalist sought profits from the manipulation of the market to make the market price and the amount sold such that his profits would be maximized. It is interesting to note that as a consequence of these various stages of economic organization, Western civilization has passed through 4 major stages of economic expansion, marked by the approximate dates 970 to 1270, 1440 to 1690, 1770 to 1928, and since 1950. 3 of these stages of expansion were followed by the outbreak of imperialist wars as the stage of expansion reached its conclusion. These were the 100 Years' War, the Italian Wars, and the Second 100 Years' War, and the World Wars. So basically, the 3 things were the 100 Years' War, the Italian War, the Second 100 Years' War, and the World Wars. The economic background of the third of these will be examined later in this chapter, but now we must continue our general survey of the conditions of Western civilization in regard to other aspects of culture. One of these is the 4th and last portion of economic level, that concerned with economic control. Economic control has passed through 4 stages in Western civilization. Of these, the first and third were periods of automatic control, in the sense that there was no conscious effort at a centralized system of economic control, while the second and fourth stages were periods of conscious efforts at control. These stages, with approximate dates, were as follows: automatic control, manorial custom, 650 to 1150. Conscious control, A. Municipal mercantilism, 1150 to 1450. B. State mercantilism, 1450 to 1850. 3. Automatic control, laissez-faire in the competitive market, 1850 to 1934. 4. Conscious control, planning both public and private, 1934. It should be evident that these 5 stages of economic control are closely associated with the stages previously mentioned in regards to kinds of weapons on the military level or the forms of government on the political level. The same 5 stages of economic control have a complex relationship to the 6 stages of economic organization already mentioned. The important stage of industrial capitalism overlapping the transition from state mercantilism to laissez-faire. When we turn to the social level of culture, we can note a number of different phenomena, such as changes in growth of population, changes in aggregates of this population, such as rise or decline of cities, and changes in social classes. Most of these things are far too complicated for us to attempt to treat them in any thorough fashion here. We have already discussed the various stages in population growth and shown that Europe was about 1900, generally passing from a stage of population growth with many persons in the prime of their life, type B, to a stage of population stabilization with a larger percentage of middle-aged persons, type C. This shift from type B to type C population in Europe can be placed most roughly at the time that the 19th century gave rise to the 20th century. At about the same time or shortly after, and closely associated with the rise of monopoly capitalism, with its emphasis on automobiles, telephones, radios, and such, was a shift in the aggregation of population. This shift was from the period we might call the rise of the city, in which year by year a larger portion of the population lived in cities, to what we might call the rise of the suburbs, and that's like after World War II, or even the period of megalopolis, in which the growth of residential concentration moved outward from the city itself into the surrounding area. New Jersey, anybody? The third aspect of the social level to which we might turn our attention is concentrated with changes in social classes. Each of the stages in the development of economic organization was accompanied by the rise to prominence of a new social class. The medieval system had provided the feudal nobility based on manorial agrarian system. The growth of commercial capitalism in two stages gave a new class of commercial bourgeoisie. The growth of industrial capitalism gave rise to two new classes, the industrial bourgeois and the industrial workers, or proletariat as they were sometimes called in Europe. The development of financial and monopoly capitalism provided a new group of managerial technicians. The distinction between industrial bourgeois and managers essentially rests on the fact that the former control industry and possess power because they are owners, while the managers control industry and also government or labor unions or public opinion because they are skilled or trained in certain techniques. The managers control industry because they are skilled or trained in certain techniques of controlling the population. Social engineering. He's talking about it right here. So anyone that says social engineering isn't real, you're going to have to tell that to Bill Clinton. Because they are skilled or trained in certain techniques. As we shall see later, the shift from one to the other was associated with a separation of control from ownership in economic life. The shift was also associated with what we might call a change from a two-class society to a middle-class society. Under industrial capitalism and the early part of financial capitalism, society began to develop into a polarized two-class society in which an entrenched bourgeoisie stood opposed to a mass proletariat. It was on the basis of this development that Karl Marx, about 1850, formed his ideas of an inevitable class struggle in which the group of owners would become fewer and fewer and richer, while the mass of workers became poorer and poorer, but more and more numerous, until finally the mass would rise up and take ownership and control from the privileged minority. By 1900, social developments took directions so different from that expected by Marx that his analysis became almost worthless. You got that? You got that, guys? Did you hear that? This is what the real people that run the world think about Marxism. Oh, Marx, oh, we're going to get it. We're going to do that dialectical Marxism. Brah. By 1900, social developments took a direction so different from that expected by Marx that his analysis became almost worthless, and his system had to be imposed by force in a most backward industrial country Russia, instead of occurring inevitably in the most advanced industrial country as he had expected. The social developments which made Marx's theories obsolete were the result of technological and economic developments which Marx had not foreseen. The energy for production was derived more and more from inanimate sources of power and less from human labor. As a result, mass production required less labor, but mass production required mass consumption, so that the products of the new technology had to be distributed to the working groups as well as to the others, so that the rising standard of living for the masses made the proletariat fewer and richer and richer. Right? And see, this is the part that we're missing now, because we've gone too far into financialization, and the middle and working class are not receiving the products of the society. So then it does make Marx's prediction more true when we start to get monopolist oligarchs. Then you make Marx's prediction more true. At the same time, the need for managerial and white-collar workers of the middle levels of the economic system raised the proletariat into the middle class in large numbers. The spread of the corporate form of industrial enterprise allowed control to be separated from ownership and allowed the latter to be dispersed over a much wider group, so that in effect owners became more and more numerous and poorer, and finally control shifted from owners to managers. The result was that the polarized two-class society envisioned by Marx by Marx was, after 1900s, increasingly replaced by a middle-class society with fewer poor and, if not fewer rich, at least a more numerous group of rich people who were relatively less rich than in an earlier period. This process of leveling up the poor and leveling down the rich originated in economic forces, but was speeded up and extended by governmental policies in regards to taxation and social welfare, especially after 1945. When we turn to the higher levels of culture, such as the religious and intellectual aspects, we can discern a sequence of stages similar to those which have been found in the more material levels. We shall make no extended examination of these at this time, except to say that the religious level has seen a shift from a basically secularist, materialist, and anti-religious outlook in the late 19th century to a much more spiritualist and religious point of view in the course of the 20th century. At the same time, a very complex development on the intellectual level has shown a profound shift in outlook from an optimistic and scientific point of view in the period of 1860 to 1890 to a much more pessimistic and irrational point of view in the period following 1890. This shift in point of view, which began in a rather restricted group forming an intellectual vanguard about 1890, a group which included figures as Freud, Sorel, Bergson, Proust, spread downward to larger and larger sections of Western society in the course of the new century as a result of the devastating experience of 2 world wars and the Great Depression. The result of this process can be seen in the striking contrast between the typical outlook of Europe in the 19th century and 20th century as outlined in the preceding chapter. All right, what time is it? Okay. All right. That's page 42. The next section is going to be European economic developments. All right. I might not think, I don't know if I'm going to be able to see. Might go blind by the end of reading this book, though. All right. That's it for now. I'll talk to you guys later, soon, whenever. Have a good day and peace.